Just give me a thumbs up when we're good to go. Alrighty. Okay, everybody, welcome and thank you so much again for joining in. I'm going to be giving a very brief, little presentation here, and then we will look at the Gutenberg block editor together a little bit. So the structure for today's presentation, I will talk a little bit about what is the block editor for those of you who maybe haven't used it before and are a little unsure. We'll then talk briefly about the block editor versus some common page builders, which are very commonly used to build WordPress websites. And then finally, as I already mentioned, we will look at some live examples of use of the Gutenberg block editor. And as Steve already mentioned, if you have questions throughout, please write them in the chat. Steve will answer to the best of his ability as much as he has time now, and then we'll push the rest over into the Q&A. So what is the block editor for starters? The block editor, or Gutenberg editor, was first made available as an additional plugin in WordPress that you could test out and install as a plugin. It then became the standard editing tool from version 5 of WordPress, which was released in December of 2018. The block editor was really brought in and intended to make editing easier, to make it more of a drag and drop experience, and to maybe solve some of the problems which led to the creation of these page builders in the first place. It comes with several blocks, like already created blocks that you can choose between, like images and galleries and quotes and many other things. But it is also perfectly possible to design your own completely custom blocks. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But what is the Gutenberg block editor? So what I have right now on the screen is an example of the classic editor, the old-fashioned editor, the one that you're all probably familiar with, where there's very little options. You can add a title, and then everything else is down here in the editor. You can also flip between the visual editing section and the text editing section, which is basically HTML or can be raw HTML. And the block editor, or Gutenberg, looks like this instead. This is just a screenshot. We'll look more at the features, but here you can add the title, and then you can begin building your page with blocks. So is the block editor a perfect editor? I would say that the block editor has maybe been a little bit fraught with tension in the WordPress community. I'd be completely open in saying that. Wasn't perfect from the start. It definitely had some issues with accessibility. Accessibility in terms of not being as easy to navigate, for example, with a screen reader or with tab and arrow keys as it should have been. Many of the accessibility issues, however, have been fixed by now. There was a really thorough accessibility review done on the block editor last year, and since then, almost all the issues have been solved, and they are working on the final issues. I mentioned that you can make custom blocks, custom Gutenberg blocks that you can use for your own website. Unfortunately, in a way, you have to know how to code in JavaScript to make these blocks, and this can be a bit of a gatekeeping thing for some of us who are not JavaScript developers. I am not myself a JavaScript developer. I'm proficient in HTML and PHP, but not JavaScript. So for JavaScript, you might need to find a friend who can help you or hire a developer who can help you. The page editors, the common page editors, still have kind of more functionality than the block editor in a way that they're a bit more intuitive drag and drop, and you can customize more things down to minute details. And then finally, some still prefer the classic editor. The block editor is kind of a tense subject with some in the WordPress community, and some really prefer to continue using the classic editor. To each their own. If you want to keep using the classic editor, it is very easy to do so by installing a plugin to override the block editor. So you can still have the newest version of WordPress, but you can be using the classic editor. So some comparisons then. The classic editor, it has few design options. As we already saw in the screenshot, it is a very, very simple thing. You can easily add code into it. Of course, you need to know what you're doing. But the advantage of such a simple editor is that it has few conflicts with theme code. Page builders, on the other hand, just a few, mention a few, are Elementor, WP Bakery, and Beaver Builder. And so let's look a little bit at the block editor then, what its advantages are. It's a standard feature of WordPress. It's built in to WordPress core. So this means that you don't need any extra installations or updates. You don't need to pay for anything either. It is entirely free. Another major advantage is that it's compatible with all future versions of WordPress. Since it's built by WordPress into WordPress, you aren't going to come into conflict in a future version because it's designed for WordPress. Some disadvantages compared with page builders, to be clear, is that it can have fewer design options, slightly fewer. Some accessibility issues still, but as I said, most of them have already been resolved and the final ones are in process. And there can be some compatibility issues with older themes. I know that one of the major reasons why a lot of people stick with the classic editor is because they're concerned that the block editor will conflict with an old theme that they're running on their website. So how about the page builders then? Again, these are, for example, Elementor, Beaver Builder, WP Bakery. They have some advantages in that they are very drag and drop experiences. You often edit on the front end of your web page and you kind of see live always what it looks like. They have almost endless customization, and they also come often automatically bundled with many themes. Some of the disadvantages, though, is that they require extra updates and they usually cost money. There's frequently a free version that's very, very limited, and then you have to pay for a version with more functionality. Once you start building in a particular page builder, you kind of lock your data in there. And if you decide at some point to switch, it can be very difficult to export your data into another page builder or just out of them entirely and into standard WordPress. So they're not standard WordPress, and there can be conflicts in the future with updates. All right, that's rounding off my little presentation. Now let's have a look. All right, so what I'm showing you is my own website, the back end of my own website, and just a demo page that I have created to show you the block editor. The first thing that you have on any page, of course, is your title. And then below that, with the block editor, you start building sort of like Lego blocks with one block on top of the other. I have set up just one block here for starters, which is a standard paragraph block. But what you want to do when you are working with the block editor is to add another block. You hover until you get to this little plus symbol and the little explanatory text that says add block. And then you can pick a block to add. What it will give you is it'll give you initially your most used blocks. And since I've been working quite a bit with the block editor, I have several here. If you haven't been, there might not be anything there yet. And it'll just give you some common blocks instead. So here we have, for example, the paragraph block. And you just click there to add it. And you write text inside your block. I've done some fancy formatting on the one up top. Whenever you're working with the block editor, You write your text in the left-hand side, and then you can adjust the settings of your block on the right-hand side here in the menu. So if I wanted to make my block as fancy as the one up top, I can choose various things like color settings. I can make the color of the text red or the background color of the block. You have lots of options here. And it kindly tries to help you and tell you when you're picking maybe a color combination that isn't so easy to read. You can also adjust the text size inside your block. And I really encourage you to do this instead of using lots of heading blocks on your page. You really shouldn't use heading blocks any more than necessary. So try and use these to adjust your text size up and down. Another really convenient thing with the block editor is that you can easily move the blocks up and down. So if I decided that I wanted this text to go above, I can either drag and drop it like that if I wanted to, but I don't really like dragging and dropping so much. So you can just push the arrow button there and move the block above. At any point while you're working with your page, you can always get a preview of what your page is going to look like. So you can click your little preview button and check out what your page looks like so far. And that's what my blocks look like so far. Now there's lots more blocks and we don't have so much time, so I'm not going to be able to go through everything, but I've done a few more blocks below that I think can be nice to know about. Maybe one of the best new blocks that has recently been added in 5.4 of WordPress is the button block. So here's a few little buttons that I've just added, but if you wanted to add a new button block, you push your little plus, and it's just buttons. Another handy feature with the block editor is that if you haven't used this block before and it's not in your most used, you can always search for blocks by typing into the search bar on the top. So button, and then I get the buttons block and can make a new button. And just like with the text, you write here, you put your link in here, and then you adjust all your colors and fancier settings on the right-hand side. Another nice thing, because often when we're building websites, we end up with not enough space between different elements on the web page, and we need a little bit more air between the different elements, is that the block editor now has a really nice little spacer block. And I've already added one here, but I can just add another one to show you how it works. Spacer. And then you get this element here, which is truly just some extra white space to make your layout not quite so squished together. And this one is extremely easy to adjust by just pulling it up and down like that to make it smaller or shorter, or smaller or longer. You can also always adjust that in exact pixels if that's important to you over on the right-hand side. I don't have too much more time, but I'm going to just scroll down to look at a few more elements which exist. But I encourage you to look around and experiment with the different blocks. It's actually really fun. This is a simple image block. And what's fun with the image block is that you can add an image and you can have it just be a normal square-shaped image. Or nowadays, they've added a kind of a rounded border around it, if you think that looks good. So you have some options to play around with the image. And you can always change the size from the full size to the large size. And you can choose really if you want it to be 75%, 50%, 25%, or specific pixels, if that's very important. Going down, I have a few more blocks. Won't have a chance to show too many more of them, But the heading block is one I think that it's important for you all to know about. Because to make a web page easier to read, it's always a good idea to have some headings if you have a lot of text that split the text up, make it easier to navigate. So you can add a new heading from the heading block. Type your text, and then you can choose what level of heading you want it to be. So if you want it to be a heading 2, which is the second biggest, and then heading 3 is a bit smaller, and then heading 4 is yet a bit smaller. And you also have heading 5 and 6 over here. Don't really think that those are so useful for most people. Try to always keep them chronological. So if you use a heading 2, put a heading 3 below it or heading 4. Try to not have too many heading 2s on your page, but try to have a chronology in terms of, and a hierarchy in a way in terms of which ones you use. Okay, I see I only really have 4 minutes left. So I wanted to just quickly show you. This is a self-hosted WordPress that I've been showing you. But if any of you are working with WordPress.com, the free or paid WordPress solution, it looks a tiny bit different. It's running a beta version of an even newer version of WordPress, and its block editor has a slightly different interface and a few more options. I won't really have time to touch too much on this now, so we can do a little bit more, or if you have questions related to WordPress.com, we can do that in the Q&A. But just to mention that it looks a little different, and you have a few more options in the menus of the editor on WordPress.com. There are also a few more blocks to choose between in WordPress.com. So you can embed a few more different types of content. And in WordPress.com, when you're adding a new block, it looks like this to add a block, and it comes up like this. Most likely, this is going to be the future look, also for self-hosted WordPresses, but it takes a little bit more time. They push the beta versions first to WordPress.com, and then they roll them out to self-hosted. So there's a few more options. The symbols look a little bit different, but everything that you can find in a self-hosted, you will also find on WordPress.com, and then a little bit more in addition. Okay.